right? He says we shared not just the gospel, but we shared our lives with you. We were delighted to share the gospel and our lives. And when you think about your community, when you think about the people around you that don't know Jesus, when you think about some of the pictures that we drew of people last night in your community that are not following Jesus yet, but they're not far from him either. And I wonder, are you delighted to share with them the gospel? Are you delighted to share with them your life? And I think incarnating the gospel is so important. And I want to read this quote from Tim Keller. I just have the last part of it on the screen. But he says this. He pastored Redeemer Presbyterian Church in Manhattan, in New York City. And he says, when we got here, we noticed that the majority of ministers and leaders did not live in the communities where their churches or parishioners were. Ministers of churches in poorer neighborhoods commuted from the safer ones and more comfortable ones. Ministers of churches in Manhattan commuted from more affordable ones. They did so because to move in with people they were trying to reach entailed great sacrifices, whether moving economically up or down. We learned that it just doesn't work. In a myriad of subtle ways, the leaders were unaware of issues their people really faced, and their ministries didn't connect. And then he says this, fortunately, Jesus didn't commute from heaven and the spirit world, but moved in with us. And I love that reality. And what Tim Keller describes here is true. Oftentimes, to live among the people that we're trying to reach has either negative or positive economic results or consequences, right? And I was coaching a church planner a few years ago, and he was planning a church in Ventura, California, and I asked him, so now where do you live? And I expected him to tell me where in the community that he lived, and he said, oh, I live in Simi Valley. Well, Simi Valley is in a different county. It's like it's close, but on a good day, it's probably 45 minutes away. And I challenged him. I said, if God's called you to plant a church in Ventura, maybe you need to move to Ventura to plant the church. And he says, oh no, we're not going to do that. And I said, well, and he said, oh no, we're gonna plant in Ventura. And the more I talked with him, the more that I understood that he was disconnected with the people he was trying to reach. And I think that if we don't live among the people, it makes it very hard for us to relate to them and the issues that they face. And so where you plant where you live. And I think I would say the same thing to those of you who are in existing churches. Live where you pastor, pastor where you live. And of proximity. And that's the first kind of principle I want us to think about is proximity and presence, right? Living among the people. 5 concepts we're looking at. The first one's proximity, being with people, being close to people. Live within the culture that you're reaching and learn the language. Now, in the when I say learn the language, that might mean learning another language, but it might actually just mean talk the way people talk, right? When I first started doing training with the BMA in Arkansas, I say y'all. The other phrase that I was taught is this little phrase, bless his heart. Are you familiar with that phrase? Bless his heart. And I got it wrong so many times I'd say bless his soul. And they say, no, Dave, it's not bless his soul. We bless his heart, you know. And there's little phrases, I know, that if I use them in the South, then I could fit in just a little bit, right? When I moved from California to Washington, I discovered that everybody knew I was from California as soon as I started conversations with people. And I was like, how do they know that I'm from California? And maybe you've picked this up, maybe you haven't, but in California, we reference all of our freeways with the article the in front of it. So instead of saying you take I-5 to I-405 on the way to San Diego, we just say, well, you take the 5 to the 405. Have any of you observed this before? It's a subtle little thing that we reference all the freeways with the word the in front of it. So you take, like, if to get from, you know, from my house, you know, say to LA, I could go I-5 down to, I go the 5 to the 170, probably then to the 101, and then cut over on the 111, right? But in Washington, they don't speak that way. They don't say the. They put the, you know, you take I-5 to the 405 to the. No, I can't hardly not do the. It just comes up in my speaking. Speak the language of those around you, right? Sometimes people get stuck on language. I don't want to spend a lot of time here, but you know, we get stuck on, well, there's a right way to speak. And if you come, you know, from the north, maybe, I don't know, I'm not a northerner, so I have no idea. But if you came from the north, you might think people in the south speak not just differently, but wrong, right? And if you move north, you might think, you know, that they speak wrong. And I want to just say, it's not wrong. It's just different, right? And I learned that going through my missionary training, right? That you have to look at differences not as wrong, it's just different. So that might mean adopting cultural ways. There's a few ways culturally that living in the Northwest I still can't adopt. Are you guys familiar here with what we refer to as the zipper merge? Like when you're driving? Okay, so in California, oh, they don't do it here. Okay, so let me explain, and again, this is just to get you the idea that sometimes you need to adapt cultural ways. So in California, we do this thing, the zipper merge. So if you're coming to a one-lane exit or whatever, you let every other car in, and it works, and the zipper merge is a beautiful thing. In the state of Washington, they don't practice the zipper merge. What they do is they get over into the right lane 3 miles beforehand, and then they putt. And so I'm a Californian, and I realized that the zipper merge actually, you know, works. And so then I speed on the other side, the left side, not speed, but, you know, I mean, I go faster than the putt, and then there's always a gap, and you just get in. And I get bad looks, and I get people that honk at me, and I get people that try to speed up and not let me in. Does this make sense to you? There are different ways of driving. So then I go on to the Washington State Department of Transportation website, and they have videos explaining that the zipper merge is the way to go. But that's not how they drive there. On-ramps. On-ramps are for accelerating. No, that's not. That is not how they drive in Washington. All right. I have a video that we could watch, but but we won't. But stop signs, they are just so polite. And so you have these moments where it's like, you go, no, you go, no, you go. Like nobody wants, and I just want to get through the intersection, you know? All right. I'm, 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 are there similarities there? Okay. All right. So here's what I would say. If you're going to plant a church in South Mississippi, maybe you have to change your driving habits. Maybe you have to, and again, that's just a very, simple way to make fun of, the fact that people drive differently in different places, right? But here's the reality. If you're going to relate to the people that God has called you to reach, you might have to do some things you don't like to do. You might have to adapt to the culture around you so that you don't become the obstacle to the gospel. So that the gospel is good news. Next concept I want to talk about is posture and position, right? Jesus, John 13, gets up from the table and washes the disciples' feet. And he takes on this posture of a servant. In fact, he even tells his disciples that the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life. And in Philippians 2, we see this same posture of humility. He emptied himself, right? Even though he existed as God, he humbled himself. He emptied himself and became obedient as a servant. Now, I don't mean to meddle, so if this is a thing here in your culture, I don't understand exactly, but I remember growing up and pastors asking for pastor discounts at different stores and places. Do you remember that? Yeah. As if we had a special class that we deserved to be treated differently. I don't think that's the posture of a servant in humility. Now I know living on a pastor's salary can be a challenge, so I'm not going to say that, but I wonder if we don't if we don't do other subtle things that in a sense make us unrelatable as ministers, or we want people to treat us with a certain level of respect. And I just would challenge us to say, hey, maybe more than being respected as a pastor, maybe we need to be just perceived as a servant. And I wonder, does anybody in your community think you're helpful? Would they look to you and your church as being helpful to our community? Because we gain credibility alongside others in our community. And one of the best books I read years ago was called The Externally Focused Church by Rousseau and Swanson. And one of the things they say, as we entered into the life of the city through service, we've had the opportunity to engage with people from whom we normally would be isolated. And we're seeing relationships formed and people taking steps toward God and his church as never before. Simply because they joined others in the community and serving and meeting needs in the community. And then he says this is powerful. He says, good deeds form a great bridge over which the good news can travel. And I think if we can adopt this mindset, this sense that we're here to serve, and then not get upset when we get treated like servants, right? I think that's part of how we start to live out the gospel, how to be a blessing, how to seek the good of our community or our city. The next thing I think is we just have to look at our practices. We need to imitate Jesus. We need to do what Jesus did. What opportunities would Jesus take advantage of in your community? Who would he join in serving? I think we need to get back to Jesus. Alan Hirsch says Jesus will teach about mission more than anyone else. Read the Gospels. I think for a couple years, that's all I wanted to do. I just want to read the Gospels, and I'd read Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Do it again. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Because I wanted to see Jesus in action, because I want to be like Jesus, right? So what did Jesus do? And what would he do if he was in your church family? Where would he serve in your community? What would Jesus endure in your community? What would he stand for in your community? What would he stand against? What would Jesus do about the poor or the homeless? I don't think he'd spend all his time in a church building. That's what I think. I think he'd get out there where the people are. So care like Jesus, pray like Jesus, bless like Jesus, give like Jesus. Just figure out, Jesus, what are you concerned about in my community? Help me to be concerned as well. Help me to do what you would do. And then I want to emphasize proclamation as well, because nobody comes to faith in Jesus without hearing the good news of the gospel. And there was some quote that kind of circled around for a while, and I don't even remember who said it or where it came from, but something about, if necessary, use words. Have you heard that one before? I don't know where it came from. It's always necessary to use words. But sometimes they won't hear your words if they don't actually see your actions, right? Because actions speak louder than words. But, Jesus, in Luke 4, he says that the Spirit of God has anointed me, right? To preach, to proclaim, to set free, to proclaim, right? There has to be a proclamation of the gospel. Colossians 1, we proclaim him, right? Admonishing every man and teaching everyone with wisdom so that we may present everyone complete in Christ. Romans 10, how can they call on the one they have not believed in? And how can they believe in the one whom they have not heard? And how can they hear without someone preaching to them? And how can they preach unless they're sent? But I think there's a difference between preaching at someone and preaching to someone, right? And I would challenge you to even consider, how do you contextualize the good news where you live? How do you communicate the gospel message? How do you equip your team or your church family to share the gospel? And I would suggest to you that in different communities, there are different aspects of the gospel that resonate more. For some, it's, sin and salvation. And we need to help people to see, that Jesus died to save them. In other communities, it might be understanding the fall and separation, right? And then redemption and restoration, right? For others, it might be the image that impacted my life of being lost and being found, right? For others, it might be understanding the distinction between evil and good, right? And what makes the gospel good news. And I think if we're going to proclaim the gospel, it's helpful to understand what message of the gospel or what theme, because the gospel message doesn't change, but what theme of the gospel resonates where we live? And then how to communicate that in a way that people can understand and repent and believe. Next concept I want to talk about is power and powerlessness. And this was made very real to me when I was taking a class on urban mission, and I went out to dinner with several students in the class with me. And there were 10 or so of us at dinner. 2 of us were white, 8 of them were African American pastors. And they challenged me on how I steward and use the color of my skin for influence. And I looked at them and I go, I don't know what you're talking about. What difference does the color of my skin make? And they said, well, your color of your skin gives you power and influence. And I'm like, well, no. I want to empty myself of power and influence. I'm not here to bring power. I want to come in powerlessness. And I want to say I'm not here with, an agenda. I'm here to serve. And they said, yeah, but you have influence that God has given you that you can't ignore. And that really challenged me, because they weren't talking about white privilege or something like that. What they were talking about is the fact that I have access to certain things that they didn't have access to. And how do I steward that sense of influence and access? That was a very uncomfortable conversation, because I wasn't familiar with what they were talking about. Neither did I know how to steward that as something that God had entrusted to me. And I just say, I know there are different cultural impacts that the color of your skin brings in different parts of our country. And being here in the South, I know that, you have a long history of challenges as a result of that. And I would just say this: while we want to come empty-handed and empty ourselves of power, let us not forget that God has entrusted us with a certain aspect of influence that might come from ways we didn't expect it. And we need to be responsible to use that. Another picture there, I think, is light and darkness. And I think we need to be shining the light, right? Let your light so shine before men that they see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven, right? But I would also say, don't shine the light in people's eyes. You ever had that happen to you, where the flashlight hits you right there, or the high beams? I'm like, man, somebody's high beams hit me, and I'm just like, high beam them back, Come on, dude, get those out of my eyes, right? Nobody likes the light to shine, but everybody loves the light. So bring the light in the way that it's a blessing, right? So let people see the light in your life and see the change and the power of God demonstrated in your marriage, or the power of God demonstrated in the way you trust, even in the midst of challenges and difficulties. I think there's a lot we can think about in that area of power and powerlessness. But how do we approach the people around us who don't know Jesus, who desperately need Jesus, so that we love like Jesus, so that we look like Jesus, so that we embody Jesus? want to challenge you to think about next the relationships that God has given you in your community where you have influence, particularly those people who don't yet know Jesus. And there are different examples in Scripture of how God uses oikos. Oikos is become more familiar word in our culture because you can see it on a whole bunch of yogurt containers in the grocery store, right? I even think I saw a commercial of oikos. I don't know if it was during the Super Bowl or during the Olympics recently, and I'm like, oh, there's that word again, oikos. We don't use that in English. Most of us don't know what an oikos is. But in the Greek, can you believe it? It's a Greek word, Greek yogurt, right? In the Greek, it conveys this idea of household, right? It's the fundamental unit of society that includes your family, your friends, your neighbors. And the New Testament gives us these examples that churches were birthed in oikos. They were started in oikos, and the gospel spread through oikos, or through households. And then they use the same word to refer to us as the household of God, right? So we belong to God's oikos, right? But we also have oikos that we are connected to. People and relationships and influence around us. And so we see several examples of this in Acts 10 with Cornelius, right? And Peter goes to Cornelius' house and shares the message of Jesus, right? And he believes, and his household, right? And I think church got started there, right? And in Acts 16, Paul, he's down at the water and meets Lydia, and Lydia believes, and her household, and she starts a church right there in her household, in her oikos, right? In Acts 16, same chapter, just maybe a day or so later, and Paul's in prison, right? And the earthquake comes, and the jailer's going to kill himself because he thinks all the prisoners have escaped. And Paul says, don't leave, right? In Acts 16:32, believe, what must I do to be saved? Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and you will be saved, and your oikos, your household, right? And the whole household comes to believe. In Acts 18 with Crispus. And so I want you to think about the reality that the gospel spreads through oikos. In fact, let me just ask this question. How many of you came to believe in Jesus because a stranger or someone you did not know shared the gospel with you? Anybody? One? Okay. Every time I do this, there's 1, 2, maybe 3, and I praise God for that. And my friend Rosalind Moss, she came to faith in Jesus because she was walking the streets of Westwood down by UCLA, and a stranger came up to her and presented the gospel to her, and God works that way. But the majority of us in this room, right, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. So 1 out of 20, that means that's, I can't even do 5%, right? See, my hand was telling me the answer, but so 5% in this room came to. So that important to remember. God uses strangers to spread the gospel. However, the rest of us, the gospel spread through oikos relationship, through a family or friend or associate, someone that shared the gospel. And so I want to challenge you to think about who are the relationships that God has given you within your oikos, within your family, friends, neighbors that don't yet know Jesus. You have a great opportunity to share the gospel with them and to be Jesus to them. In order to do that, it takes several things. First, it takes time. Time to build relationship and availability, right? Any relationship that matters, it's probably one you've invested time into, right? And hospitality, right? I don't know about you, but I think the stronger relationships I have are the people I've shared meals together with, right? I think, Larry and I enjoy hanging out together. We've known each other now for probably close to 15 years, I guess. But some of our best times have been just sharing meals together, right? And that's, I think, where connections are built, where life happens. When I assess church planners, one of the questions I always ask is, so when's the last time you shared a meal with an unbeliever? And unfortunately, for many people who are in the church, and particularly those who have been trained to be pastors, they spend all their time with believers and all their meals are shared with believers. Haven't you seen this, Larry? So many times. It's like, well, I don't have any non-Christian friends, and I don't remember the last time I had a meal with an unbeliever. And I'll ask, when's the last time you invited an unbeliever into your home? And they're like, and then they'll tell me, one of their kids' friends came over. And I'm like, no, you invited them into your home. And I would just say, if we're gonna see the gospel spread through our oikos, and if we are personally going to take responsibility before God to say, this is my circle that you've entrusted to me, that I'm going to share the gospel with these people, you've got to be hospitable. You've got to open up your home, and if your home's a wreck, then take them out to dinner. Or be in the front porch or in the backyard, right? But share meals with people who don't know Jesus. In fact, that might be the most important action step for you to take going out of this training. Really, just to spend time building relationship with people who don't know Jesus. And then spiritual intuition. I think the Spirit guides us. So listen to the Spirit. And I would suggest even just praying daily, Lord, who do you want me to connect with today? And ask God to tell you, to show you. And then to seek out that person and connect with them. Give them a call. Meet with them. Drop by. I think the Spirit will lead you. I know the Spirit will lead you. Will you follow the Spirit's leading? And then generosity. People are drawn to those who give generously. So how can you bless with generosity? And then the last thing I just say is, new life in Jesus is contagious. And if your life has been transformed by Jesus, here's what I want to say. Don't ask, just tell. All right? When I talk about the Seahawks, I don't say, hey, Larry, you want to hear about my Seahawks? And wait for him to say yes. Right? I say, we won. I mean, I go on and on about the Seahawks, and people are asking me even before the game. They'd say, so you think your guys are going to win the Super Bowl? And I'd say, I think we can. But I had this little bit of space of doubt named Sam Darnold. And, he threw 4 interceptions to the Rams during the season. And then we played him again, and he threw 2 more interceptions. And he had so many stinking turnovers. So I was hopeful, but doubt. See, look, I could just go talk about the Seahawks and just doesn't even take much, right? And then how about my Dodgers? Like I can go on all day. We're going to have a three-peat this year. You know that, right? Have you seen our lineup? Nobody is going to beat us this year, right? I don't know. Are you a baseball fan? Who's your team? Oh, sorry. I actually went to a Dodgers Cubs game once. It was very, very fun. Oh my. Okay. Baseball. Football. We don't ask permission. We just talk about it. So how come when it comes to sharing our faith, we want to say, well, could I share my faith with you? Could I talk to you about Jesus? As if, what is it? Like, permission is necessary to share who you are. I would suggest you don't need to ask permission. You just need to tell people what Jesus has done in your life. It is the strongest argument that the gospel is good news. So tell your story. We'll talk about that in just a minute. So let's think about your oikos, all right? So if you have a piece of paper in front of you, in the notebooks that have been provided, there's some pages. And I would love for you to do this with me, okay? So first, we'll just do what's up on the screen, okay? So first, I want you to draw 6 circles, if you can, on your paper there, okay? And once you have your 6 circles, I want you to think about the different oikos groups that maybe God has placed you in. And one of them, everybody gets. You can just label it your neighbors or your neighborhood, right? So you have been placed in a neighborhood, whether that's in an apartment building, what do you call it? Track neighborhood, whether that you live wherever you live, there are neighbors, even if you can hardly see their house from where you live, right? You have neighbors. So that's one you get to write down, neighbors, okay? And then think about what are the other connections that you have with people in your community. So maybe it's through your kids' sports team, or you play on a sports team. Maybe you're in a softball league. Maybe you're connected somehow to sports. Maybe there's a gym that you work out to, okay? Whatever these places where you have regular connection with unbelievers in your world, okay? So I want you to identify what are your 6 circles that you have, 6 circles of influence here, right? And then what I want you to do is think about the people you know in that circle that don't know Jesus, okay? And all I want you to do then is just write their first names. So my neighbors, John, Claire, Davy, Barb. Okay, these are people that I know that don't know Jesus. James is in my neighborhood. James knows Jesus. Joyce knows Jesus. So I don't get to write their names down. I just want you to write down the names of the people in your circle that don't know Jesus. Okay? I could go on, Brad, Annie, right? At my gym. Oh my goodness, people's names. Craig, I'm not sure that Craig knows Jesus. I think Matt does, I think. Yeah, anyway, I won't go through all in mind. What about you? Okay, so I'm going to give you just a few minutes. See if you can identify 6 different circles and write down the names, first names only is fine, of people who don't know Jesus in your circle, okay? you have written down their names, what I want you to do is just count up how many names of unbelievers are on your piece of paper. Hopefully there's at least one. For some of you, there might be 10, 15, could be 20. I just want you to count up the number, okay? And then I'm just gonna have you write down your number, okay? Have you counted your number? Can you count? Do you want to take a guess? All right, did you count? Okay, just write 6 in one of those boxes for me. There you go. All right, you're my example. We're just gonna pass it around. Don't need to pay attention to other numbers. Just put your number in one of those boxes and pass around, and hopefully get it back up to me at some point. That would be great, okay? All right. We all have people in our lives that don't know Jesus. And I think it's important for us to remember that they're not far from God. I think sometimes we think, oh man, that person never's going to come to know Jesus, right? But they're not far from God. And God has placed these people, I believe, in your oikos so that you could share Jesus with them. But at the same time, we'll talk about what do we need to share in a minute, but I think we need to maybe consider how can we connect with others who don't know Jesus? Where can we connect with people that don't know Jesus? So we have some existing relationships, but where can we connect with someone else? So last night we drew maps. If you have your map, you can look at that again. You can just think about your neighborhood. But I'd like you to think about what if you labeled all 6 of your circles here, then you're good. You don't have to do this exercise. You can just take a little break. But if you didn't label all 6, I would ask you to consider what would be one more place that you could perhaps see the gospel spread through oikos. And so I have a whole bunch of examples up here in very small print, but I'd love for you to consider, maybe it's through sports, maybe it's through music or choir or recitals, private lessons, homeowners association, PTA, volunteering at the public school, neighborhood watch, chamber of commerce, carpools, health club, babysitting, service clubs, athletic boosters, preschool moms group, golf or country club, block parties, meetup.com. Meetup.com was something that was really popular years ago. It's still around. If you want to get to know people in your community, there are meetup groups that are actually eager for you to join them. They actually want people to connect with. And if you say, Dave, I have no idea how to connect with people in my community, I'd say go online to meetup.com and find out what groups are already meeting. Maybe there's a salsa dance group that you want to go dance with. I don't know what would be good for you, Larry. Let's think. No. Maybe there's a bowling club. Maybe there's a running club. Maybe there's some group that already has a network of people who don't know Jesus that you could naturally join. I think sometimes we think, I've got to start something. No, you don't. You don't have to start anything. There's groups already in your community that are ready for you to join them. I was doing this training few years ago, and one of the guys was like, "Well, I love to read," and I said, "Well, what if you joined a book club?" And he went down to the local library and he found a book club and joined them so he could begin to connect with people who didn't know Jesus because he didn't have any friends outside of his church. Everybody he hung out with was already following Jesus. Yes, it is. It's totally bad. Yeah, because how are you going to be light? I think it's totally bad. I think it's great you have non-Christian friends. I think that's excellent. I think it's totally bad if you didn't have any. Wait, let's say it again. I didn't say it was bad. I said it was totally bad to not know any non-Christians. I just want to make sure you get the angle that I'm coming from. It's not okay. Okay, let's do this. I didn't originate this, but this to me is helpful sometimes. Okay, just snap your fingers with me. Can you do that? I don't have any rhythm, so if I get off, that's fine. Okay. So while we're snapping our fingers, I was told there's only two things you can't do in heaven. Did you know that? Only two things. One of them is sin. The other is introduce people to Jesus. Which one do you think he left us here to do? I don't think it was sin. Okay, stop. Every time you snapped your fingers, somebody entered into a Christless eternity. Let's tell people about Jesus. I'm not here to motivate you toward evangelism because I think that motivation comes from the Holy Spirit within us. But what I'm here is to try to help you think, how can you engage with people who don't know Jesus? And how can you help your church family, the disciples who you are training to be disciple makers, to engage with people who don't know Jesus? Because they are all around us. All right, let's talk a little bit about what do we have to share. And this is a really simple exercise that I would love for you to do in your notebook or on your phone. I just want you to complete these sentences, okay? So, before I met Jesus, my life was, and just describe in one sentence, not a whole paragraph even, just write one sentence. I realized I needed Jesus when I committed to my life to Christ when, and I'm going to give you about 5 minutes, and I just want you to complete these sentences, okay? And then I'll tell you what's next. Sometimes when we think about what we share or what our testimony is, we think about a long paragraphs. Sharing a story, you have your 3-minute testimony, you have your 1-minute version, you have your 5-minute or longer version, and you can train people how to do all those things. I don't think I need to help you there. I think these are just simple sentences that fit into conversations. And you can share them all in a row, or you can just share them as you're having a conversation, getting to know someone. And how natural just to say, well, in my life, before I met Jesus, it was like this. And you just share it, right? Or, I realized I needed Jesus when. And be able just to share a simple concept, which might prompt someone to say, tell me more, or, oh, I don't do that Jesus thing. Whatever it is, whatever their response, it will lead to more conversation. And I wonder, what if you trained all your disciples to simply have sentences that are naturally to flow out of their mouths that they had practiced with their Christian friends that they could then share with their non-Christian friends? And I wonder, what if you actually printed these out or wrote them down on a piece of paper and put them next to your bed or on your desk or on your mirror, and you just read them every day and said, Lord, who do you want me to share this with today? And just see what happened. In China, there's a movement called Tea for Tea that I was introduced to with Steve Kim and Ying Kai, and they've baptized over 1.7 million believers. One of the things that they're committed to within their disciple making is to share their story with 5 people every week. And the reality is, when they share their story and invite people if they want to follow Jesus, half the people that they share it with say yes. And it has had a remarkable impact in over 150,000 churches being started. When I share about what God's doing internationally, the comment I get often is, well, that wouldn't work here, or that doesn't work here, which is even a stronger statement. And I said, how do you know that that wouldn't work here? Have you shared your faith with 5 people this week? And I think the reality is, the reason it doesn't work here is because disciples don't actually share what Jesus has done in their lives with people who don't know Jesus. And if we're not sharing, then how do we expect anybody to follow Jesus? Well, we hope that Holy Spirit's the one who convicts of sin, and he's going to do that. And yeah, he will. He will. But how can they believe? How can they hear if someone doesn't tell them? So my encouragement, my challenge in this session is really just be Jesus. Look for people who don't know Jesus. Love like Jesus. Share your story. And as we wrap up, if you have this card still, if you don't, I'll pass around a few more. But there's a couple questions that I'd love for you to just talk with somebody and then head to lunch, right? Because we're going to do lunch at noon. So 2 questions on the blue, being Jesus to everyone, everywhere. How have you blessed or served the needs of others recently? And with whom have you shared your grace story this week? So why don't you just have a conversation with that, and we'll consider that our ending, and we'll